first time the feared Korean Mafia boss realized he had made a terrible mistake was when 3 loud women blocked his exit and asked him why he hadn't eaten enough. Cassie and Ryu had stared down men who carried guns without hesitation. He had walked through rooms where people lowered their voices just because he existed. His name alone had ended negotiations before they began. But now, are you deaf? Or are you just pretending? One of the women snapped, hands firmly planted on her hips. He blinked once. Twice, Cassie and Ryu, the man who had never feared anything in his life, found himself calculating escape routes from a living room. Across the room, his wife, Zariah Cole, calmly sipped her drink, watching the scene unfold like it was a perfectly scheduled performance. She knew exactly how this would end. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was how a man who once ruled an empire ended up here, being interrogated about his eating habits by her aunties. And more importantly, why he wasn't leaving. Welcome to Annie's Empire of Love, your cozy sanctuary for the most beautiful, slow burn romance audiobooks. We are dedicated to bringing you genuine love, emotional healing, and pure romantic butterflies with brand new stories posted every day. Thank you for being part of our growing family. Today, we are stepping into a story that will challenge everything you know about secrets, survival, and a cold mafia king who meets his match. Before we dive into this emotional roller coaster, make sure you are subscribed to the channel and leave a thumbs up on this video. Now, let's find out what happens when the underworld collides with an innocent heart. Cassie and Ryu did not knock. He never had to. Doors opened for him out of fear, respect, or survival instinct. But tonight, standing in front of a modest 2-story house with a chipped mailbox and wind chimes that refused to be ignored, he found himself pausing. The silence around him felt unfamiliar. No guards, no polished marble floors, no quiet obedience, just the faint sound of music drifting from inside. He adjusted his cufflinks anyway. Old habits didn't dissolve overnight. When the door finally opened, it wasn't because of his presence. It was because Zariah Cole had already seen him through the window, and she didn't look surprised. She leaned against the frame, one eyebrow slightly raised, as if she'd been expecting a package that arrived late. "You're standing there like the door is going to bow to you," she said calmly. "It won't." Cassian stared at her for a moment, not because he didn't understand the words, because no one had ever spoken to him like that and lived comfortably afterward. "I need a place to stay," he said. No explanation, no apology, just a statement. Zariah didn't move aside. Instead, she glanced past him briefly, as if checking for something. "Where are your people?" "I don't have any." That was new. The words felt strange even to him. She studied him for a second longer. Then, without warning, she stepped aside but only halfway. "You can come in," she said, "but not as whatever you used to be out there." Cassian stepped forward. She held up a hand. "Shoes off." He froze. Her expression didn't change. "This house doesn't care about your past life. You take those off, or you stand outside and reflect." Cassie and Ryu, who had negotiated billion-dollar deals without blinking, looked down at his shoes. There was a long pause. Then, slowly, he bent down and removed them. Zariah nodded once. "Good, now we're getting somewhere." As he stepped inside, she pointed toward the hallway. "Second rule, you don't give orders here." He said nothing. "Third rule," she continued, walking ahead of him, "if you're staying, you contribute. That starts tonight." Cassian's eyes followed her as she disappeared briefly into the kitchen. When she returned, she placed a broom in his hand. He stared at it. Zariah met his gaze, completely unbothered. "Welcome to your new empire." The next morning, Cassian Ryu found himself standing in the middle of a grocery store. He had never noticed how loud they were. Carts squeaking, people debating prices, children negotiating snacks like it was a business merger. Zariah handed him a list. "We're not leaving until everything here is in the cart," she said. He glanced at the paper. "Why are there percentages written next to the items. Coupons, she replied casually. Cassian looked at her like she had just introduced a foreign language. You negotiate? With paper? Zariah smiled slightly. Watch and learn. What followed was nothing short of a strategic operation in Cassian's mind. He observed everything, the way she compared brands, the way she waited for discounts, the way she confidently walked up to the cashier and applied multiple coupons like she was closing a deal. He leaned closer. This system is inefficient, he murmured. No, she said, not looking at him. You're just not used to it. At one point, he stopped in front of a shelf and stared at two identical products. What is the difference? He asked. One is cheaper. That is not a difference. That is a flaw in pricing structure. Zariah laughed softly. People nearby glanced at them mostly because Cassian looked like he had walked out of a luxury magazine and accidentally ended up in aisle 5. By the time they reached checkout, he was holding the bags like they contained fragile assets. This experience, he said slowly, requires optimization. Zariah shook her head. You're not building a system, you're buying groceries. He considered that, and for the first time in a long time he didn't argue. Cassian should have known peace wouldn't last. The knock on the door came without warning. Zariah didn't even look surprised. That'll be them, she said. Them? Cassian asked. He got his answer immediately. The door burst open. 3 women walked in like they owned the house and possibly the neighborhood. Zariah, you didn't tell us you had company. Cassian stood up automatically. The first woman approached him without hesitation. She looked him up and down, unimpressed. This is the one? Cassian blinked. I am, she pinched his cheek. Hard, he stopped talking. The second woman circled him like she was inspecting merchandise. You're too skinny. The third crossed her arms. And why do you look like you don't eat home food? Cassian Ryu, feared across cities, stood still while 3 women evaluated him like a questionable investment. He glanced at Zariah. She was smiling. That's my husband, she said calmly. The room went silent for exactly 2 seconds. Then chaos resumed. Why didn't you say that first? Sit down. You need proper feeding. Cassian found himself being pushed toward a chair. He didn't resist, because for the first time he wasn't sure what resisting would accomplish. Cassian adapted. Not quietly, not subtly, but thoroughly. Within 3 days, the house had structure. Schedules appeared on the walls. Tasks were categorized. A whiteboard had been introduced. Zariah stood in the kitchen, staring at it. What is this? Cassian adjusted his sleeves. An operational system. For what? The house. She turned to look at him fully. You made a business plan? For laundry? It is inefficient to approach tasks without hierarchy. He pointed at the board. Color coding improves productivity. Zariah laughed so hard she had to sit down. Cassian didn't understand why. Later that evening, he held what he referred to as a briefing. Zariah showed up out of curiosity. He walked her through it. Dishwashing has been reassigned to evening cycles. Cooking preparation begins at 1600 hours 1600? She interrupted. Yes, that's 4 o'clock. He nodded. She covered her face. You turned dinner into a military operation. Cassian paused. Then said, very seriously, it was necessary. Cassian decided he would cook, not assist. Not observe, but cook. Zariah had gone out briefly. When she returned, she immediately noticed the silence. That kind of silence meant trouble. She stepped into the kitchen. And stopped. There was flour. Everywhere. On the counter. On the floor. On Cassian. He stood in the middle of it, holding a spoon like it had betrayed him. What happened? She asked carefully. I followed the instructions. She walked closer, examining the scene. What instructions? The ones I found. She looked at the recipe, then back at him. You doubled everything. Yes, why? He hesitated. Efficiency. Zariah laughed, not softly, not politely, but fully, openly, uncontrollably. Cassian watched her. At first, confused. Then something shifted. Because she wasn't mocking him, she was enjoying him. When she stepped closer to help clean, their hands brushed briefly. Neither of them pulled away immediately. The kitchen was still a disaster. But the moment wasn't. And for the first time since losing everything, Cassian Ryu felt like he had gained something he didn't know he needed. Cassian Ryu did not believe in small beginnings. In his world, things either launched with force or did not exist at all. Deals were measured in influence, outcomes in territory, and success in silence, because when something worked, no one questioned it. So when Zariah Cole suggested they start something small, he assumed she was easing into a larger plan. He was wrong. Their business meeting took place at the same kitchen table where he had previously failed at cooking. This time, however, the table was clear except for a notebook, 2 pens, and Zariah's calm focus. "We need something practical," she said, flipping open the notebook. "Low cost, quick turnaround, something the neighborhood actually needs." Cassian leaned back slightly, observing, "You are thinking too narrowly," he replied. "We should consider scalability from the beginning." Zariah didn't look up. "We should consider paying the electricity bill first." He paused. That was a valid point. Still, old instincts didn't disappear quietly. "We can position ourselves as a premium service," he continued. "Create exclusivity. Control supply." Zariah finally looked at him. "We're not launching a luxury empire," she said plainly. "We're starting with something simple, something real." Cassian studied her for a moment. Then, slowly, he leaned forward. "What do you suggest?" She tapped her pen against the page. "Food," he blinked once. "That is, broad. Not just food," she clarified. "Affordable, home-style meals. Something people can rely on. Busy families, workers, students, people who don't have time but still want something good." Cassian considered the idea. It lacked grandeur. But it had structure, demand, consistency, repeat customers. He nodded once. "Then we established standards." Zariah smiled slightly. "I knew you'd say that." The next day, they set out to secure supplies. This, in Cassian's mind, was where things would finally align with his strengths. Negotiation, control, precision. They approached a local produce vendor, first a man who greeted Zariah warmly, and immediately began discussing prices before Cassian had even spoken. Cassian observed for exactly 30 seconds before stepping in. "These rates," he said calmly, "are inconsistent with market value." The vendor blinked. Zariah closed her eyes briefly. Cassian continued, "We are prepared to establish a long-term partnership, but only if adjustments are made." The vendor crossed his arms. "Adjustments?" Cassian nodded. "Favorable ones." There was a pause. Then the vendor laughed. Not politely, not nervously, but openly. Zariah stepped forward before Cassian could respond. "Don't mind him," she said smoothly. "He just discovered grocery stores last week." The vendor chuckled again. "Ah, that explains it." Cassian looked between them. He did not understand why his approach had failed. It was direct, efficient, clear. Zariah leaned slightly closer to the vendor. "We're just getting started," she said. "Nothing big yet. But we'll be back often. And we pay on time." The tone shifted, subtly but noticeably. The vendor nodded. "I can work with that." Within minutes, they had secured a reasonable deal without pressure, without strategy, without resistance. As they walked away, Cassian spoke. "You reduced leverage." Zariah shook her head. "No, I built trust." He considered that. It was unfamiliar. The second vendor interaction went worse. Cassian attempted to negotiate again. This time, he introduced what he believed was a structured proposal. It included projected demand, supply consistency, and what he referred to as mutual benefit alignment. The vendors stared at him, then said, "So, you want tomatoes?" Zariah had to step in again. By the third attempt, Cassian stopped speaking entirely, not because he had given up, but because he was observing, learning and adjusting. By the end of the day, they had everything they needed: ingredients, packaging, a basic plan. As they returned home, Cassian carried the supplies with the same focus he once reserved for high-stakes exchanges. This model, he said slowly, is inefficient in execution, but effective in outcome. Zariah smiled. That's your way of saying it worked? He nodded once. Yes, she glanced at him. You're learning. Cassian did not respond immediately. Because she was right. He was learning. Not how to dominate a system, but how to exist within one he did not control. And strangely, he didn't dislike it. That evening, they sat at the table again, reviewing their next steps. This time, Cassian did not lead. He contributed, refined ideas, suggested structure, adjusted timing. But he did not override. He did not command. He worked with her. Zariah noticed. She didn't say anything about it. But her smile lingered a little longer than usual. And for Cassian Ryu, a man who had once measured success in power, this quiet, shared progress felt unexpectedly significant. Progress, no matter how small, has a way of attracting attention. Cassian Ryu understood that better than most. In his previous life, attention meant surveillance, competition, or quiet threats wrapped in polite conversations. It was rarely accidental. It was usually strategic. So when a sleek black car pulled up in front of Zariah Cole's modest home just as they were setting up their first round of meal deliveries, he noticed immediately. He didn't need to see the driver to know this was not coincidence. Zariah, on the other hand, continued arranging containers on the table with steady focus. If that's another customer, they're early, she said. Cassian didn't respond. Because he already knew who was stepping out of the car. The man moved with the kind of confidence that came from inherited authority rather than earned discipline. His suit was expensive, but not understated. His expression carried amusement, not caution. He walked toward the house like he was approaching something temporary, something beneath him. Cassian, the man called out, his voice carrying just enough volume to be noticed, but not enough to seem aggressive. This is unexpected. Zariah looked up. Her gaze moved from the man to Cassian, then back again. You know him? She asked. Cassian's expression did not change. Yes, that was all he offered. The man stepped closer, his eyes briefly scanning the setup, the containers, the handwritten labels, the simple arrangement. Then he smiled. I heard rumors, he said casually, but I didn't believe them. He gestured lightly toward the table. This, he added, this is what you've reduced yourself to? Zariah straightened slowly, not defensively, just enough to acknowledge the shift in the atmosphere. We're working, she said. The man's attention shifted to her. And you are? My wife, Cassian said before she could answer. The man's brows lifted slightly. Wife? He repeated. That's new. There was no approval in his tone, only curiosity mixed with mild disbelief. He took another step forward. I always wondered what it would take to bring you down, he continued, looking back at Cassian. Turns out, it wasn't a rival. It was this. His hand moved again, indicating the house, the street, the life. Zariah watched him carefully. Then she spoke. You talk a lot for someone who hasn't been invited inside. The man paused. Just for a second. Then he smiled again, this time sharper. I'm not here for comfort, he said. I'm here because it's fascinating. Cassian remained still. Zariah did not. She stepped forward, placing herself slightly between them, not in fear, not in protection, but in control of the conversation. What exactly is fascinating? She asked. The man looked at her, amused, that a man who once commanded entire operations is now packaging meals. Zariah nodded slowly. And you drove all the way here to say that? The question landed differently than expected. The man hesitated. Only briefly. But it was enough. Zariah tilted her head slightly. Because from where I'm standing, she continued, it looks like you needed to see this more than we needed you to. Silence followed. Not the heavy kind. The precise kind. The kind that shifts balance. The man's smile faded just a fraction. You're bold, he said. I'm honest, she replied. Cassian's gaze moved toward her, not because he was surprised, but because he recognized what she was doing. She wasn't reacting. She was redirecting. The man glanced back at Cassian. You're really staying here? He asked. Cassian answered without hesitation. Yes, no explanation, no justification, just certainty. The man studied him for a moment. Then he exhaled lightly, as if releasing something he hadn't fully acknowledged. That's unfortunate, he said. There was still room for you if you had returned before this adjustment. Cassian did not respond, because there was nothing to negotiate. Zoraya crossed her arms. Well, she said calmly, it sounds like you wasted your trip. The man looked at her again. This time, there was no amusement, only evaluation. Then, slowly he nodded. Perhaps, he said. He turned, walking back toward his car without another word. No threats, no dramatic exit, just departure. But the message had been delivered and dismissed. The moment the car disappeared down the street, the air shifted back. Zoraya turned to Cassian. So, she said, that was interesting. Cassian looked at her. You were effective. She smiled slightly. I've had practice. He believed her. Because what she had done wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. But it was precise. She hadn't defended him out of obligation. She had dismantled the situation entirely. Cassian glanced at the table, then back at her. You didn't have to intervene, he said. Zoraya shrugged. I wasn't intervening, she replied. I was clarifying. He studied her for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, he stepped closer. Not enough to draw attention, just enough to close the distance slightly. I am not accustomed, he said slowly, to being defended. Zoraya met his gaze. You're not being defended, she repeated. You're being supported. There's a difference. Cassian considered that. Support, it was not a word he had built his life around. But standing there, in front of a house that had no guards, no gates, no hierarchy, he understood its weight. And more importantly, he understood its value. They returned to their work without further discussion. But something had shifted. Not in the business, not in the environment. In him. Because for the first time, when someone from his past tried to define him by what he had lost, he didn't feel the need to respond. Not because he couldn't, but because, standing beside Zoraya, he didn't need to. The first profit did not arrive with noise. There were no announcements, no flashing numbers, no quiet nods from men in suits acknowledging a deal well executed. There was no sense of scale to it, no immediate expansion, no ripple effect across networks. It came quietly. Folded into a small envelope Zoraya Cole placed on the kitchen table. Cassian Ryu looked at it for a long moment before reaching for it. This is it? He asked. Zoraya leaned against the counter, arms loosely crossed, watching him with mild amusement. That's it, she said. Our first real profit. He opened the envelope carefully, as though expecting something more complex inside. There wasn't. Just cash. Simple, direct, undeniable. Cassian counted it once. Then again. Not because he doubted the amount, but because he was trying to understand the feeling attached to it. This is smaller than expected, he said finally. Zoraya nodded. Of course it is. He looked up. But it matters, she added. Cassian held the money between his fingers, weighing it in a way that had nothing to do with its value. In his previous life, numbers moved differently. Larger, faster, detached from effort in a way that made them almost abstract. This was specific. Measured in hours spent cooking. In time spent standing, preparing, delivering. In conversations with customers who knew their names. It was not impressive by his former standards, but it was precise. He placed the money back into the envelope and set it down. We should reinvest immediately, he said. Zoraya smiled. We will. There was a pause. Then she pushed herself off the counter. But not tonight. Cassian frowned slightly. Why not? Because tonight, she said, we celebrate. He glanced at the envelope again. This does not qualify as a milestone. Zariah walked closer. It qualifies to me. That was enough to interrupt his logic. He studied her expression, searching for exaggeration. There was none. She was serious. Cassian exhaled quietly, then nodded once. Very well, he said. We will celebrate. He approached the task with the same mindset he applied to everything else. Deliberately, thoroughly, incorrectly, Zariah had stepped outside briefly, leaving him alone with his thoughts and, unfortunately, his initiative. By the time she returned, the living room had been transformed. Lights adjusted. Music playing. 2 glasses placed neatly on the table. Cassian stood near the center of the room, posture composed, as though he had just finalized an arrangement rather than prepared for a simple evening. Zariah paused at the doorway. What is this? She asked. A celebration, he replied. She stepped inside slowly, looking around. You rearranged the entire room. It required balance, he said. She laughed softly, shaking her head. You didn't have to do all this. Cassian tilted his head slightly. I chose to. There was no exaggeration in his tone, just intention. Zariah walked further in, her gaze settling back on him. Well, she said, since you went this far, we might as well make use of it. She moved toward the music source and adjusted it slightly, something softer, less structured. Then, she turned back to him. Are you going to stand there? She asked, or are you going to join me? Cassian hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but because this kind of moment did not exist in his previous life. There had been celebrations before, but they were loud, strategic, often public. This was different. Private, unstructured, unnecessary, and yet he found himself stepping forward anyway. Zariah reached for his hand without ceremony. No hesitation, no question, just contact. Cassian looked down briefly, then back at her. This is not efficient, he said quietly. Zariah smiled. It's not supposed to be. She guided him into motion, slow, simple, uncalculated. At first, his movements were precise, almost mechanical, as though he were mapping out each step before taking it. Zariah noticed. You don't have to think this much, she said. I am not thinking, he replied. She raised an eyebrow. You're definitely thinking. Cassian paused. Then, after a brief moment, he adjusted. Not dramatically, just enough to loosen the control he was used to holding. The shift was subtle, but noticeable. Zariah's expression softened. There you go, she said. They continued in silence after that. Not an uncomfortable silence, just one that didn't need to be filled. The music carried the moment. Cassian's focus shifted not to the steps, not to the environment, but to her. The way she moved without calculation. The way she allowed the moment to exist without trying to control it. It was unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. Eventually, the music slowed, then stopped. But neither of them stepped away immediately. Cassian looked at her. You consider this sufficient? He asked. Zariah smiled. I consider this perfect. He held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once. Then it was successful. She laughed lightly. You really don't know how to relax, do you? Cassian considered the question, then answered honestly. I am learning. Zariah's expression shifted slightly at that. Not surprised, not amused, just aware. Because he wasn't saying it casually. He meant it. Later that night, the envelope remained on the table. Unchanged, untouched, but no longer insignificant. Because it wasn't just money. It was proof. Not of success in the way Cassian once understood it, but of progress. And for the first time, that felt like enough. The offer arrived on a rainy afternoon that carried no sense of urgency, only inevitability. Cassian Ryu noticed the vehicle before it even stopped outside the house. It was too clean for the street, too deliberate in its timing. The kind of arrival that did not ask for permission, because it assumed none would be denied. Zariah Cole noticed it too, but she said nothing. She simply continued arranging containers for the day's orders, as if the world outside the gate did not have authority over the one inside. Cassian stepped toward the door. I'll handle it, he said. Zaraya glanced up briefly. You always say that, she replied, and it usually means trouble is about to become paperwork. He did not respond to that, because she was often correct in ways he did not enjoy admitting. When he opened the door, the man standing outside did not introduce himself. He did not need to. He carried the kind of presence that belonged to rooms Cassian had once controlled, but not anymore. I won't take much of your time, the visitor said. Cassian studied him. Then don't waste it. A faint smile appeared. Direct as always. The man reached into his coat and produced a slim folder. He did not offer it immediately, as if waiting for acknowledgement that the contents still held weight. Cassian did not reach for it. After a brief pause, the man placed it on the small table near the entrance instead. It has been decided, he said. Your former position is available again. Full restoration. Assets, territory, authority, he spoke the words cleanly. Like restoring order to something temporarily misplaced. Cassian listened without interruption. Inside the house, Zaraya continued working, but her attention had shifted slightly. Not toward the conversation, but toward the silence that followed each sentence. The visitor continued. There were complications after your departure. Things stabilized, but not efficiently. Your structure is still the most effective. A pause. All that is required is your return. Cassian looked down at the folder, then back at the man. For a moment, the old world felt close again. Not distant, not forgotten, just waiting with the patience of something that believed it would eventually be chosen again. He stepped outside, closing the door behind him. Zaraya did not follow. She did not need to. The conversation unfolded where it belonged. Cassian picked up the folder but did not open it. You are offering restoration, he said. Yes, to what end? The man hesitated slightly. To what you built. Cassian nodded once, as if confirming something already understood. Then he asked, and what I built without me, does it not stand? A flicker of discomfort crossed the man's expression. It functions, he admitted. Cassian corrected him quietly. Then it does not require me. The silence that followed was longer this time. The rain continued steadily, softening the edges of the street, but not the weight of what was being decided. You are refusing? The man asked finally. Cassian looked past him briefly, toward the house behind him, toward the faint sound of movement inside, toward the life that did not operate in percentages of control or inherited authority. Then, he answered, yes, the simplicity of it carried more finality than any negotiation ever had. The man blinked once. You understand what you are giving up. Cassian's expression did not change. I understand what I am choosing. A pause. Then, quieter this time, the man asked, and what is that? Cassian did not look back at the folder. He did not need to. Something that does not require me to become someone else in order to remain in it. The man said nothing after that. There was nothing left to counter. After a moment, he inclined his head slightly, not in respect, but in recognition of a closed door, and returned to his vehicle. Cassian stood there until the engine faded from view. Only then did he turn back inside. Zaraya looked at him as he entered. No dramatic ending? She asked. Cassian shook his head. There was nothing to conclude. She studied him for a moment. And the offer? He placed the untouched folder on the counter. It no longer applies. Zaraya didn't ask for details. She didn't need them. Instead, she simply nodded once and returned to her work. Cassian watched her for a moment longer than necessary. Then, quietly, he stepped beside her and picked up the next container. She glanced at him. You're helping now? I am participating, he corrected. A faint smile appeared on her face. That sounds like you. He did not respond. But something in his posture had changed again. Not a return to what he was, but a continuation of what he was becoming. And for the first time, the crown that had once defined him no longer felt like something lost, only something no longer needed. The neighborhood had a way of deciding what mattered long before anyone tried to label it. Cassian Ryu noticed that within the first few weeks. No one cared about his past. No one asked about titles or territories or the kind of power that once bent entire systems around his decisions. Here, recognition was earned differently. It was earned through consistency, through presence, through showing up. And Cassian, without realizing when it began, had started showing up. Not as a ruler, not as an outsider trying to adapt, but as someone who belonged to the rhythm of Zariah Cole's world. The morning started like most mornings now, containers being arranged, orders checked, conversations with neighbors who greeted them like family rather than customers. Cassian stood by the counter, carefully sealing packages with more attention than necessary. Zariah watched him briefly from across the room. "You're pressing too hard," she said. He paused. "I am ensuring durability. It's food, not a diplomatic treaty." He adjusted slightly without argument. This too had become normal. Small corrections, shared space, quiet negotiations that did not end in dominance, but balance. Outside, the sound of laughter drifted in. The Aunties had arrived. Cassian noticed it before he saw them. Of course he did. 3 voices entered the yard like an announcement no one had requested, but everyone accepted anyway. They carried bags, food, and opinions, none of which required permission to exist. Zariah exhaled lightly. "They're early," she said. Cassian looked toward the window. "I noticed." The first auntie entered without knocking. "You two are still working?" she asked, scandalized. "On a day like this?" The second followed closely behind. "This house needs joy, not labor." The third walked in last, scanning the room like she was assessing a situation she already intended to improve. Cassian instinctively straightened. Not out of fear, out of habit. Zariah leaned toward him slightly. "Don't react," she whispered. "I am not reacting," he replied. The first auntie pointed at him. "You look less stressed today," she said. Cassian blinked. "I am, unchanged." She clicked her tongue. Liar, before he could respond, she was already rearranging something on the counter. The second auntie turned to Zariah. "We brought food. Real food. Not whatever he calls efficiency meals." Cassian did not object, not because he agreed, but because he had learned that disagreement in this house was often irrelevant. The third auntie approached him directly. She studied him for a long moment. Cassian held still. Then she nodded once. "You're different," she said. "I am the same," he replied. "No," she said simply. "You're softer." That word landed differently. Cassian did not answer immediately, because there was no strategic response to it. Only observation. Zariah watched the exchange quietly, her expression unreadable. But there was something in her eyes that Cassian had come to recognize. Approval. Later that afternoon, the yard filled with noise. A table had been set outside without consultation. Food appeared in waves. Conversations overlapped. Laughter rose without structure. Cassian stood slightly aside at first, observing. Then, slowly, he was pulled in not by invitation but by inclusion. A plate was placed in his hand. A seat was made available before he asked for it. No one waited for him to decide whether he belonged. They simply acted as if he already did. Zariah sat beside him at some point. Not announcing it. Not marking it. Just there. "You're quiet," she said. "I am listening," he replied. "To what?" Cassian looked around. "Life," he said simply. She glanced at him. "That's new." He considered that. Yes. A breeze moved through the yard, carrying the sound of voices that no longer felt foreign. For a long moment, Cassian did not think about what he had lost, or what he had refused, or what had once defined him. Instead, he looked at the people around him. At the table. At the laughter. At Zariah. And understood, without needing to explain it to himself, that nothing about this life required permission. Only participation. Zariah leaned slightly closer. "You okay?" she asked. Cassian nodded once. "Yes," a pause. Then, quieter, more certain. "This is my kingdom now." Zariah smiled. "Good," she said. "Because we don't do lonely kings here." Cassian looked at her. And for the first time, He did not correct the word king. He simply stayed.